Welcome to All Home Care Matters, the show where we discuss all things home care, with discussions on important age-related matters and topics. Brought to you by Enriched Life Home Care Services, the #1 rated home care provider in Michigan by Top Rated Local.
Hello, and welcome back to All Home Care Matters. If this is your first time visiting us here at the show, we want to say thank you for taking time out to be with us today. We appreciate how valuable everyone's time is, and that's why we try and make each episode here at All Home Care Matters something that will hopefully matter to you. Today, we are honored to welcome a remarkable guest who has an even more remarkable story, Kelly Meany. Kelly was a child caregiver for her mother and is now a therapist and life coach. Welcome, Kelly. Thanks for being here today. How are you?
I'm doing well, and thank you for having me on your show.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure. So I want to kind of start with what brought you to the show. It wasn't because you're a life coach. It might have something to do with being a therapist, but you have a personal story of being a family caregiver for your mother who suffered a traumatic brain injury before you were even born and ended up being in a coma for like 12 weeks. What was that like growing up with a parent who had a brain injury?
Yeah, so my life looked a lot different than any other kids that I went to school with. My mom was in a traumatic brain injury accident that left her in a coma for 12 weeks when she was just 13 years old. And essentially, it left her a child forever. And so here I am. I grew up an only child, and I basically taught her how to do things. I remember being 6 years old and teaching her not to steal by pointing out cameras in the store, telling her what would happen. I cooked my own meals. I walked myself to school. In a lot of ways, I was like Matilda. And I knew from a very young age that I was meant to be more. And so what brought me to the show was I'm a therapist and a coach, but I really want to help people on more of a macro level through sharing my story.
You know, somebody listening to this might think, okay, my girls love Matilda. It's a good movie. I wouldn't want to live it though as Matilda. What was that like though, being 5, 6, 7 and beyond years old, and you have parent teacher conferences, you have maybe Girl Scouts or athletics or help with homework. Was your dad in the picture? Was it a single mom situation? Like, how did you navigate that?
TV connections. So basically, I would watch The Simpsons. I would learn how to do life from TV or through my friends' parents. I would describe myself as living a feral child. Unfortunately, my father, he was an alcoholic. He was a severe alcoholic. In fact, I never met my father sober. He was literally a morning to night drunk. And your question of most people would think that Matilda was great. I very recently, I would say the last 2 years, after seeing Ed Mylett speak, Ed Mylett said a quote that I'll always remember. He said, "Make your trauma be what happened for you instead of what happened to you." And so I'm kind of embracing who I am and where I came from in a way that, again, I can help others. But no, growing up was extremely difficult, and it was extremely hard to navigate because I had no structure. There were no boundaries in my home. Like I said, my mother was a child, and then my dad was a morning to night alcoholic.
Wow. You know, most people later in life become a family caregiver for a spouse, a parent. Some people have children born with disabilities and they're a caregiver once they enter parenthood. Myself, I became a family caregiver, though I never identified as that in my early 20s. But you're starting out, as a toddler, essentially. How do you feel like that has impacted you emotionally and helped you really to become the person you are here today?
Sure. I suffered many years, many, many years with my own depression and anxiety from, again, growing up in the household that I grew up in. I think that it was just realizing that, okay, every day when I was a kid, I'd literally be like, gotta get through this day. I gotta keep going. I got to keep going. And I think that's just what kept me alive.
Did you have any like parents of your friends or teachers at the school or adult role figures in your life as a child that really had grave concerns for your well-being given the situation?
Yes, I actually, was a life changer for me. When I was 7 years old, the court ordered that I be in a program similar to Big Brothers Big Sisters. This program was called Mentor Iowa. And I was matched with a woman, her name's Jennifer, and 30 some odd years later, she's actually still in my life today. And just having that stable, consistent, reliable adult changed my life. And I literally believe if it wasn't for her, I may have been a statistic. But she would pick me up once a week. We would go on outings. Which, again, just knowing that Jennifer was there and just having that consistent support of someone within the community really, really, truly helped me.
Was Jennifer more a motherly figure or an older sister? Like, what's the age difference between the two of you?
It was about 16 years. So I would say more of a motherly role. I've always considered her more of a surrogate mother.
Then, you get into your 20s, you survive your teens, so you kind of reverse the statistics, like you were saying. But then your mom was diagnosed with dementia.
Yes. So my mother, about 14 years ago, was diagnosed with dementia. And this is going to sound funny, but the diagnosis was actually the best thing that happened as far as her and I's relationship because she was not kind to me as a child. She was physically and emotionally abusive. Again, from the brain injury, she had no impulse control. The dementia, everyone that meets her now would describe her as a kind, funny lady. And we're able to really have this profound relationship. And I'm able to kind of see her as a human being.
How so it took that for you to then see her as a human being?
It wasn't that I saw her as a human being. It was more of it wasn't safe for me to be around her. So I was eventually taken away from the home, and I was able to see her with supervised visits. When I was again in my early 20s was when she was diagnosed with the dementia, and it was a complete switch. So again, she's extremely loving, she's kind, she's funny, she's a good person. But I also think back to your question, it took me becoming a therapist and years of therapy myself to understand that, we all have parts of self. And my mom wasn't being mean to me because she was malicious or a bad person. But when we're children, right, we can't understand that. And so again, it took me, becoming an adult and becoming years of being a therapist to really understand her as a full person.
Yeah, we see countless different situations. We have a home care company, and it's a wide spectrum of issues and complications and illness and disease that people face, and especially with dementia and the TBIs, traumatic brain injuries. And it's hard, right? It's easy for us to say it to somebody, but it's harder for them to appreciate and really grasp the reality. That's not your mom intentionally or your dad or your spouse intentionally being mean or swearing at you or saying very hurtful, mean things. It's the illness doing it. And
Correct.
and but that's hard, right? Because when you look at somebody with a TBI or dementia, often they look like you and I look. And so they look like, psychologically we think, oh, that they're normal, they don't have sores or a broken arm. So it's hard to adapt to that, really their perspective of what they're looking like on the outside, but it's the inside that's hurt, not the outside. Did you have your mom's her parents, like your grandparents, were they involved?
Yes, and that's actually who when I went to live with my grandmother, who was my mother's mom, when I was 9 years old.
Okay.
And I lived with her for 3 years. But I was living with an 85-year-old. So it was still, she was able to keep me. However, I was still walking myself to school, making my own meals. She was in her own way bedridden. And I still regularly saw my mom. But that too was hard. And so here I am going from another caregiver who is, again, doing the best that she can. And I really believe, as both a professional and a human being, that we operate in the best that we can with what we know how. And so that's what my grandmother was doing too. And I'm forever grateful that she took me in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, now that you kind of have some perspective of hindsight, right? How would you recommend to families that might be going, maybe not through an exact situation like yours, because I can't imagine that you've encountered a lot of people that have a story like yours, but there's a lot of people out there that are caring for a spouse or a parent or a child. They're trying to juggle their own self-care, their own well-being, their own professional responsibilities, earning an income to keep their household going. How do you balance being a caregiver while also being able to maintain your mental health and your personal life?
3 words that I would tell all caregivers out there: give yourselves grace. So if you're feeling short fused, if you're like, oh my God, I could have done more in this day, or I should have done this, just take a deep breath and give yourself grace and recognize that you're doing the best that you can with what you have on this given day. And so I think that would be my number one tip, is just giving yourself that grace.
Absolutely, and that's great advice, Kelly. When did you ever eventually move back into the home with your mom? Or when you left at 9 and went to grandma's for 3 years, did you go somewhere else until you were an adult?
Once my grandmother was too old to take care of me, that's what brought me to the East Coast. I moved from Des Moines, Iowa to New York to live with extended family until I was 18. After that, I moved back to Des Moines and went to University of Iowa and
Okay,
became a therapist.
wonderful. Well, I would just, when do you remember the moment for you where it went from that childlike perspective of, this is my mom, but she's not nice to me and I'm mad at her, I don't understand, to then, maybe a more aware Kelly then looks at it and says, my mom has a problem. I want to help her. I'm not going to be resentful or upset with her and hold it against her because she can't help it. Like, was there a transformation between the one perspective to the new one?
I remember the day, and it was, people say, they woke up and that's kind of what happened for me. It was the day that I graduated with my master's degree, and I didn't invite her to my undergrad degree. And I spoke at my college graduation. I spoke and shared my story, but I didn't want her there because even then I still had so much hurt and anger, which I have to love that part of myself too, right? That is totally okay because again, I was very badly treated. Again, it wasn't any fault of her own, but as a child, we can't really process it. So fast forward to it's the morning of my master's degree, and I said, you know what, I want my mom there. And I said she deserves to see me, and none of this was her fault. I'm not really sure what came over me that day, but I would say that was the day that I really just saw her for all of her parts and what it was. And I went and I picked her up, and she came, and we got wonderful pictures. She doesn't remember any of it, but she remembered in the moment. And that's what I'll tell people too who have a spouse or a loved one with dementia. It's very similar to if you take your infant to Disney World. They're not going to remember when they're 5 or 6, but they remember in the moment. And so just seeing her smile and how happy she was and tears of joy, it meant the world to me.
In your mom and the toddler at Disney may not remember it afterwards, but you get to remember it, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
No, that's wonderful. What kind of advice would you offer to others caring for a loved one with these, TBIs or, traumatic brain injuries or dementia, especially if they're in the younger role? Like we had a lady on about a year or two ago, and not the same circumstance, but her father was a very big overachiever, could do no wrong. He was a very high level functioning alcoholic, and the extended use of the alcohol day in and day out eventually led to alcohol induced dementia. And that was very, very hard for her, extremely hard, as I'm sure it would be for any of us. She was in her young teens, and this carried on through her 20s. What advice, given, your experience and, kind of I'll call it maturity into this role and your, educational background now as a therapist, what can you offer others that might be listening or watching this that are like, okay, she made it, but there's no way I'm going to
Mhm.
make it. I don't know what to do.
Right. What I can offer you is allow yourselves to grieve. And sometimes grieving might be a lifelong process, and that is okay. I believe that we are, as human beings, are all healing, ing. I don't believe we're ever truly healed, EED, right? And so it's very important to know it's okay to grieve, right? In our society, someone dies, okay, you're given 2 days of bereavement. That's not enough time. For someone like me, I spent my whole entire life grieving. Lance, I spent my whole entire life grieving because, again, right off the bat, I was not born into your typical mom dad situation. And so it is okay. And there doesn't have to be a timeline. And surround yourself with other people in the community that understand you. So that would be my biggest advice. Allowing yourself to grieve and connection.
Yeah, no,
Connecting.
I love that one. I'm always asked, what's your top tip for family caregivers?
Mm.
I said it's kind of like 1A and 1B. 1A is know that you're not alone. You may not know it,
Mm.
you may not see it in your social circles, but there are others out there going through similar circumstances. You need to connect with them and build that support. And my 1B or my 1A, depending on the day you catch me when you ask, is take care of yourself first so that you can be there for your loved one. Because if you let yourself go, it doesn't matter what happens to your loved one, you're going to need the help, right? And so
Yes.
I love that advice. Kind of sticking with your experience though, Kelly, it's obviously deeply influenced, your work as a therapist. How do you help your clients who are struggling with caregiving and, the stress and the burnout that comes along with it?
Talking about the concept of grace and that, we as human beings, again, we all have parts of self. I'm really big into internal family systems with Dr. Schwartz, and it's absolutely true. And again, we will have our good days and we will have our bad days. There are some days where my mom asking me the same question 100 times rapid fire within 5 minutes, I want to pull my hair out, right? Still in present day, and that's okay. There are some days where I'm better equipped to handle it. And
Right.
so I would just say it is okay to meet yourselves where you're at in that day. And if it's a day you feel like I can't do it, that's okay too. It doesn't mean that tomorrow and the next day and forever is going to be I can't do it. It's just where you are in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. When we spoke previously, you were sharing some of your approaches and things, and you have unique therapy approaches incorporating EMDR, IFS, and QNRT. First, I'm going to have you explain what those are because most people won't know. But how can these techniques help caregivers who are just feeling that emotional sense of being overwhelmed and just on overload?
Sure. So the reason why a lot of us hit a wall with traditional talk therapy is because our minds and our brains can only process so much on the conscious level. So we can't just think our problems away. A lot of our stress, well, all of our stress and traumas are stored at the unconscious level, right? So they're stored in our nervous system. And so all of the three treatments that we listed, internal family systems, EMDR, QNRT, really what it does is it goes in and it rewires and essentially rewires the nervous system. And so if someone was really struggling, I may refer them to see a therapist in one of these modalities. I may do techniques with them. Recently, I started a social media page and I'm just kind of doing, tips of the day. It's a combination of both me and my mom that go on, and then me that just goes on and gives tips. And then also just sometimes my mom, she has very dark humor. And like I said, the brain injury. Affected her as staying a child, but things like her wit and her dark humor stayed forever. And so I would just refer people to uh, being in the moment, deep breathing, or if they wanted to, trying one of those modalities of therapies. A lot of people haven't even, like you said, heard of these types of therapies.
What's the social media for your tips and things that you're doing, Kelly?
Some of the tips that I've had is connection is key. So again, even if we're just connecting with a stranger, The grocery store, right? If we're at the grocery store and they say, "How was your day?" I think we're so conditioned to say, right, the words good or okay. But I'll say, "Actually, I'm having not so good of a day today." And it's actually sparked so many beautiful conversations. Sometimes they're like, "Oh, me too." There's been a lot of me too moments. So I talk a lot about connection and just how important connection is. Also, again, giving ourselves grace, knowing that if you're not acting the way you think that you should, right? I always say we shouldn't ourselves because at the end of the day, again, we're operating in what we have and what we know how with the tools that we have.
Absolutely. What's the social media handle where people can go follow you at?
Sure. It's called The Ellie Show. So my mom's name is Ellie. She named me Kelly because it rhymes with Ellie. And so she's always wanted to be on TV and do stuff like that. And so I just 2 months ago actually made it. And one of the videos overnight got like 25,000 views. So I thought that was pretty cool. And yeah, I plan to just kind of keep going with it. I think it's been really helpful. A lot of people in the dementia community and caregiving community have been following me.
No, that's wonderful, Kelly. So, oftentimes when people go through these situations, sometimes there's a sense of almost embarrassment, or I don't want to use the word shame, but they're not wanting to outwardly share their personal, stories. Um, and that can bring up complicated emotions, especially when, you have a history of trauma and neglect, things like that. How do you recommend and suggest that caregivers set boundaries while still being present for their loved ones?
Sure. And to speak on your shame, I lived in shame most of my life. In fact, up until very recently, people didn't even know that my mom had the traumatic brain injury. I would only talk about the dementia. And so, again, it took very recently to me embracing who I am and
Mhm.
that no one can take two things away from us, which is our education and who we are, what we've overcome. And I just realized very, very recently, I would say in the past year or two, that wow, I'm still, not only am I still standing, but I became a therapist and I overcame a lot.
Yeah, you
And so, yeah, I think just to answer your question about the boundaries and the caregiving, just it's okay to feel shame, right? But you don't have to be defined by that shame that you feel. And knowing again that the shame may not stay with you for the rest of your life. If you're in the shame now, that's okay. But just knowing, I think it's important, again, the Me Too moments, people think that they're all alone. You don't know how many people that have sat on my couch that have said, well, their relationship's perfect or their relationship's perfect, probably not even realizing that the person they're talking about is also on that couch, right? So a lot of times we live in very enclosed lives because we don't want to have ourselves be vulnerable. And one thing that I realized very again recently is I think my greatest strength is my story, and that's what's going to help people the most.
Yeah. Well, and you've talked about wanting to help people on that macro level through
Mhm.
your speaking and writing, and we'll get to your book that you're working on in a minute. But what's the biggest message you hope to share with those that are caregiving and going through this trauma?
Reach out for support, that you don't have to do it alone. Again, I think I would have become a statistic if I didn't have Jennifer. People don't realize how important these human connections are. And the best way it can be described is, can you think of a teacher that you had in maybe the first or second grade or third grade, like a teacher that you had for a year that made an impact on you? So if you still remember them all these years later, that right there is an indicator what this connection can do. And so even if it's just smiling at somebody today, that alone could be what got that person through that day. So I think my biggest piece of advice would just be put yourselves out there and connect, and that it's okay to reach out for help.
Have you ever met with anybody that's gone through a similar situation as you have?
In my 12 years of therapy, I have never met someone who has been through the trauma that I have. And it's kind of what, again, it used to be something I was really ashamed of. I would be like, oh my God, there's no one like me. And now it's kind of a perspective change of, wow, there's no one like me. Okay, I have a story to get out there. I have a message to say that even people I come from, and again, I would never say this on camera, even a year ago, probably. And I recently updated my LinkedIn. It is literally on my LinkedIn what I'm about to tell you. I have and come from all 10 of the ACE scores. And for those of you that don't know, ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. It was the CDC's largest healthcare study ever. And it determined it was 10 yes or no questions based on before the age of 18. These questions range for: did you witness domestic violence? Were you abused? Did you live with a parent who had alcoholism? Was one of your parents in jail? I answer and check all 10 of those boxes. Less than 1% of the population of Americans check all 10. And I had one client that hauled all 10, and he's okay with me sharing this, that spent most of his life in prison. And so I, Kelly, again, am standing before you, and I want to tell you that healing is possible.
Yeah. Well, I think you're a testament to, what people can overcome, right? And what people have to face that we may not even know they're facing, which leads to, your thing you were saying about, when somebody says, how are you doing? You don't always have to just say, I'm good. If you're having a bad day and you're comfortable with sharing with that person, share with them, because that might be just what you need to hear that day. That might help lead to, a better day tomorrow too. Exactly. I just think as a society, we have to be more empathetic to what people are going through. And when they're going through something that we may have experienced, you can be sympathetic. And I think you're on the start of a very macro level way of helping people, Kelly, because I think, the unfortunate story, and I don't know if you'd even call it unfortunate, but the situation you had to endure growing up, I think has led you to this point in your life where you're going to be able to take that and turn it into something very strong and meaningful in helping others.
Thank you.
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you.
So I mentioned that, we're not putting it into the show notes because it's not fully published yet, but, you kind of held up, I believe, at the start before we started recording, a book that you are close to publishing, maybe?
Yes, I'm super excited.
You want to hold it up?
I don't have it right now, but I am writing a book that I've wanted to write a book for the past 10 years. And actually, I very recently, the way I discovered the Q&R treatment, which is called quantum neuro reset therapy, which is what made me want to go and become trained in it and be able to do it myself with my clients, is after my first Q&RT treatment was when I started writing. And it came up in my treatment that what was holding me back was fear of failure. And so the opposite of failure is success. And again, that's when all these ideas came about sharing my story, and, the shame pretty much dissolved. I don't know how else to describe it. And the best way I can describe it is, I could ask 100 people if they like my shirt, and 50 might say yes, 50 might say no, but I'm still going to wear the shirt because I like it. And so my book is about the power of saying no. It starts off with talking about the 4 attachment styles, so avoidant, anxious, disorganized, and secure. I come from the most rare of the 4. I come from disorganized, and that's usually formed when, again, there's a lot of neglect and abuse. I also had 4 caretakers, so I bounced around a lot growing up. And it's about how an uncomfortable no is better than a resentful yes. And it's my realization as both a therapist and, a person, a human, that we all have something in common, no matter socioeconomic status, no matter age, no matter gender, and that is we all have a difficulty with the concept that no is a complete sentence. And so my book is about the power of saying no, and that it doesn't necessarily hurt relationships, but it can also actually strengthen them to have beautiful, more authentic relationships that are created around boundaries.
No, it sounds fascinating. You'll have to let us know when you get it published.
Yes.
We have a pretty wide audience here, and we get emails from family caregivers and even people who are dealing with health issues who have caregivers. So I want to really talk to them for a moment and kind of lean into your expertise. If somebody's watching or listening to this right now and they're struggling with the emotional toll of caregiving, what's the one piece of advice you would want them to know and to kind of take away from your appearance here today?
Well, the one piece of advice, if there was nothing else to say, is you are not alone. And for me, I don't know, it may not work for everyone, but for me, there was just a lot of comfort with someone saying, hey, I'm here, or I'm here to listen. If you're someone that can't afford, which a big part of my story, right, was I grew up in intense poverty. You know, my mom and dad were both on food stamps, Section 8, all that. And so again, I understand too this idea of, well, I can't afford a therapist. And so you're not alone. And also, there's a lot of free support groups in the online community. There are resources. There are the library. Utilize your library. People, including myself, always forget about our libraries. But if you Google your local library, it's amazing how many free nightly events that they have. In fact, I actually went to one, again, no money, couldn't afford anything. I went to a grief support group at a library when I was in my early 20s. That was super helpful. And so I would just recommend, if you can, if you have the resources, find a therapist. Preferably one that specializes in internal family systems, EMDR or QNRT, and also put yourself out there, right? Know that it is okay to ask for help.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And I know you're working on a website, but I want to have you talk about it real quickly because, you know, this video will be up for the indefinite future. So somebody watching it 6 months, a year, 5 years from now, they might want to go to your website. It's healingwithkelly.com. You think it's going to be up soon, or is it up now?
Yes, it should be up soon. I also have my own therapy and counseling practice. So that if someone wants to contact me, they can do it through that. And that is called Darien Counseling and Coaching.
You want to spell that real quick?
Yeah, sure. So Darien, Darien, and then the word counseling and coaching.com.
Okay. And are you comfortable with sharing an email if people wanted to email you?
Yes. My email that people can reach me on is kelly@healingwithkelly.com.
Perfect.
And that's spelled with a Y. So KELLY@healingwithkelly.com.
Fantastic. All right. So Kelly, if we don't talk for the next 5 years, but I'm sure we will, and we ran into each other somewhere in New York, and I said, oh, what have you been up to? Where are you at 5 years from now? What's your goal?
Well, I am currently working with a TEDx coach. So my goal is to have given a TED Talk, to have this book, if not a few books, and to be known as the connection guru, right? So the person that came from extreme adversity, but overcame and again, understood the importance of connections. And you being one of them. Thank you for allowing me again to be on the show.
Absolutely. Our pleasure. Well, Kelly Meany, thank you so much for sharing your story and your family's story. And we'll look forward to watching you continue to help people at a macro level.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us today here at All Home Care Matters. All Home Care Matters is here to help families as they navigate these long-term care issues. We invite you to visit us at allhomecarematters.com, where there's a private, secure, fillable form where you can give us feedback, show ideas, or if you have questions. Every form is read and responded to. And remember, you can listen to the show on any of your favorite podcast streaming platforms or watch the show on our official YouTube channel. Just make sure that you hit that subscribe button so that you never miss an episode. We'd also like to say thank you again to Kelly Meany for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again here at All Home Care Matters.
Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to you joining us again on another episode of All Home Care Matters. To learn more about the show and to connect with us, visit us at allhomecarematters.com.